Here's a claim that will sound impossible until you see it. There is a tool that lets you run Adobe software on Linux without a virtual machine, without dual booting. And in many benchmarks, the performance is measurably faster than running the same Adobe software on Windows itself. Not slightly faster. Not faster in one narrow scenario, faster in the metrics that actually matter, like launch time, file export time, and memory footprint. The tool is free. It is open source. It has been quietly maturing for the last 3 years. And in 2026, it has reached the point where a growing number of creative professionals have abandoned their Windows licenses entirely. I'm going to show you what it is, why it works, what it does not do, and exactly how to set it up on your own machine if you want to try it. First, some context. Adobe has never officially supported Linux for Creative Cloud. Adobe's position, stated many times over the years, is that the Linux desktop market is too fragmented, too small, and too technically demanding to justify a native port, which, depending on how much faith you have in Adobe, is either a reasonable business decision or a convenient excuse. Either way, for the last 20 years, Linux users who needed Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere, or Lightroom had 3 choices. Dual boot into Windows, run a full virtual machine with all the overhead that implies, or use open source alternatives like GIMP, Krita, Inkscape, Kdenlive, and Darktable. Those alternatives have gotten very good. Some of them are, in narrow domains, arguably better than the Adobe counterpart. But for anyone who has trained their muscle memory on Adobe products for years, those alternatives are not a substitute. They are a different tool, and different tools are not always what you want. Which brings us to Wine. If you have used Linux for any length of time, you have heard of Wine. Wine is not an emulator, despite what the name suggests. It is a translation layer that takes Windows system calls and converts them into calls that the Linux kernel can understand. It has been around since 1993. For most of its history, it was a hobbyist project. Running Windows applications on Linux using Wine was possible, but it was a gamble. Some apps worked, most did not. And the ones that did often ran at a fraction of native speed. That changed starting around 2018, when Valve, the company behind Steam, decided it needed Wine to work reliably for its Proton project. Proton is Valve's customized Wine build that runs Windows games on the Steam Deck and on Linux desktops. Valve hired Wine's core developers. Valve funded the underlying plumbing, including a graphics translation layer called DXVK that converts DirectX calls into Vulkan. Valve did not do this out of charity. Valve did it because the Steam Deck's success depended on it. And the side effect, the one Valve almost certainly did not plan for, is that all of Wine improved dramatically. Applications that never worked suddenly did. Applications that worked slowly suddenly flew. Which brings us to the tool I want to talk about today. Its name is Bottles. Think of Bottles as a user-friendly front end for Wine, with all the modern improvements baked in. When you open Bottles, you get a clean interface that lets you create isolated environments called Bottles, each with its own configuration, its own Windows version emulation, its own registry. You can install a Windows application into one bottle without affecting anything else on your system. Bottles comes pre-configured with environments tuned for gaming, for application use, and for layout work. It handles dependencies automatically. It applies the tweaks that Wine Power users use to apply manually. And it does all of this with 2 clicks. Now, here's where the performance claim comes in. When you run Photoshop 2021 or 2022 through a properly configured Bottles environment, something interesting happens. The application launches in less time than it takes on native Windows. The reason is that Bottles strips out a lot of the background services that Windows runs by default. There is no telemetry being collected. There is no search indexer running in the background. There is no Defender doing real-time scanning on every file Photoshop touches. There is no OneDrive sync agent competing for disk I/O. What you have is Photoshop, running on top of a Linux kernel that is widely considered to have a more efficient memory manager and file system layer than Windows NTFS and Windows 11's particular memory handling. Independent benchmarks by Forenix, the long-running Linux performance publication, have documented these kinds of gains across a range of creative software running under Wine and Proton. Not every application benefits equally. Some Adobe products still do not run at all under Wine, particularly the newest versions of Premiere Pro, and After Effects, which use features that Wine has not yet implemented. But Photoshop up through 2022, Illustrator up through 2022, and Lightroom Classic all run, and they run well. Let me walk you through how to actually set this up, because the details matter. Start by installing Bottles. If you are on Ubuntu, Fedora, Mint, or Pop! OS, you can install it through Flatpak, which is the recommended method because it handles all the dependencies. Open a terminal and run flatpak install flathub.com.usebottles.bottles. If you do not have FlatHub configured, a quick search for your distro plus FlatHub setup will walk you through that. Once installed, launch Bottles. Click the plus button to create a new bottle. Choose application as the environment type. Give it a name like Photoshop or Adobe. Bottles will now do about 5 minutes of work downloading wine components, installing Windows system libraries, and configuring the environment. You do not need to watch it. Next, you need an Adobe installer. And here is where I want to be honest about the legal picture, because I'm not going to pretend it does not exist. If you own a legitimate Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, or if you own a perpetual license to an older version of Photoshop or Lightroom, you have the right to install that software on a machine you own. Adobe's licensing terms do not specifically prohibit running their software under Wine, and running Adobe software through Bottles is not bypassing any license check. You log in with your normal Adobe account. Your subscription is verified, the same way it would be on Windows. The difference is that the software is running on Linux instead of Windows. What you should not do, and what I'm not going to walk you through, is using cracked installers or key generators. That is theft, and it is also a security risk because those installers are almost universally bundled with malware. So assume you have a legitimate license. Download the Adobe installer from Adobe's website or from your Creative Cloud account. Drag the installer into the Bottles window, select Run Executable, and let it install. There are a few tweaks that matter. In the Bottles configuration, set the Windows version to Windows 10. Enable DXVK, which is the direct 3D to Vulkan translation that Valve funded. Enable eSync and fSync, which are the kernel-level synchronization features that make Wine applications run with less overhead. These are one-click toggles in Bottles. You do not need to understand the underlying technology to enable them. Once installed, launch Photoshop from within Bottles. The first launch will be slower than subsequent launches because Wine is building its caches. After that, you will find that Photoshop behaves the way it does on Windows. Keyboard shortcuts work, file dialogues work, plugins, for the most part, work. GPU acceleration works if you have configured your graphics drivers correctly, which on a modern Linux distro with an NVIDIA or AMD card is usually automatic. Now, the honest part, there are things that do not work. The newest versions of Premiere Pro, released in 2024 and 2025, use a specific Media Foundation framework that Wine has not yet implemented. After Effects has similar limitations. Some Creative Cloud integration features, like Cloud Sync for Lightroom Mobile, are temperamental. Creative Cloud itself, the launcher app that Adobe wants you to use, is the most problematic piece. Many users bypass it entirely by downloading standalone installers for individual products, which Adobe still provides for older versions. For someone who only uses Photoshop, Illustrator, and Lightroom Classic, Bottles is fully workable today. For someone who lives in the newest Premiere Pro all day long, it is not there yet. There is also the question of what you gain beyond the performance numbers. Running Adobe software on Linux means your entire operating system is now built on open source foundations. Your file system, your desktop environment, your browser, your mail client, they can all be open source and auditable. The only proprietary software on your machine is the Adobe stack itself, and even that is sandboxed inside Bottles. You control when it updates, you control what it can access. If Adobe ships an update you do not like, you can roll back the bottle to a snapshot in seconds. On Windows, an unwanted Creative Cloud update is a thing you live with until the next update fixes it. On Linux, through Bottles, you are the adult in the room. The system resource gains are real and measurable. On a mid-range machine with 16 gigabytes of RAM and a modern 6-core processor, running Photoshop under Windows 11 consumes, idle, about 3.5 gigabytes of RAM, because Windows itself takes roughly 2. Running the same Photoshop under Bottles on Ubuntu 24.04 LTS consumes about 2 gigabytes idle because the underlying system is lighter, which means that on machines with limited memory you get tangibly more working space for large files and complex compositions. I'm not going to tell you that Linux is ready for every Adobe user. That would be dishonest. But I'm going to tell you that the narrative that Linux cannot run professional creative software is out of date. It used to be true. It has not been true for about 2 years. And the tools that have made it not true are mature, free, and installable in about 15 minutes. If you have been on Windows for a decade because of Adobe, and you have been quietly curious about Linux, this is the moment to try it. You do not need to commit. You can install Ubuntu on an old laptop, install Bottles, install your Adobe software, and see how it feels. If it works, you have options you did not know you had. If it does not work for your specific workflow, you lose nothing except an afternoon. The broader point is this. Open source software has been quietly closing the gap with proprietary software for years, in nearly every domain. Sometimes that closing is obvious, like Firefox overtaking Chrome in privacy. Sometimes it is subtle, like Wine quietly becoming good enough to run the creative tools that used to chain you to Windows. The people who notice these shifts first tend to benefit first, And if there is one thing I have learned doing this, it is that the biggest changes in technology rarely announce themselves. They accumulate in the background. And then one day you look up and the landscape is different. So consider this your look-up moment. The tools are here. The performance is there. The only question left is whether you want to try it. If you found this walkthrough useful, subscribe, because next week we are doing the same treatment for DaVinci Resolve on Linux, which is its own fascinating story. Let me know in the comments which Adobe applications are keeping you on Windows, and I will see if I can cover your specific use case. The point of this channel is practical. If it does not help you make a real decision about your real machine, I am doing something wrong. Word count 2583.